Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good morning to every members of the floor. Welcome to the semi-final of the English debate competition InterVarsity Science e-Debate Challenge 2021. The motion for this debate is this House support the use of genetic engineering to disease-resistant human. I will be the chairperson and also act as the timekeeper for this debate. Now, allow me to introduce the debaters to you. Acting as a government team for this debate is the team from UM with Catherine Alicia Nathan as the Prime Minister, Danish Ram Agarwal as the Deputy Prime Minister, Kohan Kartikeyan as the government whip. Acting as the opposition team for this debate is a team from IMU with Ashika as the opposition leader, Sandra as the second opposition speaker, Mikhail as the opposition whip. On behalf of the House, I extend a special welcome to our panel of educators, Mr. Muhammad Farhan Shah bin Shahabuddin, Ms. Aisha Nadira Ahmad Najmi, Mr. Lai Yue Jun, Mr. Patrick Shaw William, and Mr. So Jun Yi. A quick reminder, POI is allowed after first bell rang at the first minutes and end at the 6 minutes with another rang. Please keep your video open, and if you have connectivity issues, then please open your camera during the speech and also POIs. If you are disconnected from the debate, the timer will be paused and you will have 10 minutes before the floor is passed to the next speaker. This debate is a silent debate. Now we come to our debate today. To open the case from the government team, I call upon the Prime Minister to start the debate session. The floor is yours.
Before I start my speech, if you have any POIs, just put them in the chat and I will get to you. All right. In a world of unpredictability, it's time for humans to utilize genetic engineering to ensure that we're able to adapt. What I'm going to do in my speech is explain to you in regards to what this gene editing looks like, what status quo is, and the problem that we are facing, and the two arguments. Firstly, why it is ethical, and secondly, why gene editing is the most effective disease resistance out there. Firstly, what is gene editing? We think gene editing is modifying the human body on a cellular level to respond to stimulus. And the stimulus here in question is diseases. We think we're able to get better immune responses to any disease or ailment. So if you have a genetic component in your body that it has the ability to develop cancer, we will modify the cells to remove the stimulus. So we will modify cells that have the potential to turn into tumors, and we will ensure that we're able to make sure that the whole body is healthy. This looks like medical procedures that alter the cell structure and create a blueprint for new cells that don't have the potential to turn into diseases in the future. And we think later on, your offspring will be able to inherit these genetically engineered cells. For example, a pregnant woman will pass down these cells to the child. And this is how we are able to continue these genetically engineered cells throughout the human family tree, I guess. What happens in status quo? We think right now we're looking into the effects of genetic engineering in the body in regards to the feasibility and the application of it. We're looking into how human resistance and genetic engineering is interlinked. And let me tell you, the results are promising. There's strong evidence to show that there is a revolutionary response against all sorts of diseases and when we are able to implement genetic engineering. But the problem in status quo right now, in regards to the alternative methods that opposition might want to posit, is that there are too many diseases to deal with that we don't really have cures for. This looks like HIV or AIDS. In regards to other diseases, we don't really have an appropriate response to eradicate diseases, where we only have medications to manage symptoms. This is like cancer, where we only use chemotherapy as a preventive solution, but we can never really eradicate cancer as a whole. The most promising solution to the problems that I told you about just now is the modification of genes on a cellular structure to respond to diseases better. And before I move on to the metrics of this debate, I want to caveat first and tell you that this debate isn't about immediately applying the methods of genetic engineering today, but we think it's rather a continuous study, funding, and support of genetic engineering to ensure that it is safe and applicable to a majority of humans and diseases in the future. panel, we think the side that is able to prove that there is a valuable promise in this technology and there's a potential in saving many lives, we are able to win this debate. But before that, what does support look like on our side of the debate? We think support looks like continued guaranteed funding to institutions that experiment in genetic engineering. This looks like, especially in areas of disease. And we would ensure protection from fundings to other sorts of bodies that continue genetic engineering. So I want to focus this debate in regards to disease resistance as a whole, and not really in regards to funding to other areas of genetic engineering that have other applications, i.e. creating superhumans. We don't think this warrants our support, and this is not part of the debate. First argument, why do we think this is ethical? There's a concern to take into account in regards to humanity's life on Earth, and in regards to how our actions disrupt the natural order of things. And I think opposition will want to prove to you that genetic engineering disrupts this natural order. But our argument and our contention to this is no, because we would argue that genetic engineering is a development and an extension of medical technology. What does medical technology look like, and why do we think this is an extension? We think medical technology that have been able to extend the lives of humans, for example, heart transplants and chemotherapy, are all perfect good examples of people extending their lives past the natural expiry date. We think this also extends to things like treatment to deadly viruses like vaccines that people contract, or even just anti-venoms that modify your bloodstreams to be more resistant to toxins. These are all examples of us adapting to the changing world and extending our lives, and genetic engineering is just an extension of this. Why then do we think humans have a right to extend our lifespan? We think we are the most evolved, and in regards to our breakthroughs in the medical field, we have pioneered everything, right? So we in a world where we're able to create humans that are more resistant to the environment, we think that is perfectly justified. We think in regards to that as well, genetic engineering is an alternative to diseases anyway, right? Because in status quo, it is already okay to prolong our lives in suffering diseases. Humans have always made an attempt to adapt to current and future diseases, which is why we continue research in gain of function research, which looks like modifying current viruses to predict new mutations and then prepare to that. That is just an extension of us preempting future diseases through genetic engineering, and this extension of us just adapting better to our world in general. The only difference is genetic engineering shortens that process and makes it safer. Consider it as a highway. We're able to combat dangerous diseases before it's even formed. And before opposition brings out arguments like cloning, we think cloning is a completely different aspect, as cloning is in regards to creating a new life, and that there's arguments of ethicality there, whereas on our side, we're just extending the lives that we have. In conclusion, we have proven that it is ethical. Second argument, why do we think this is the most effective form of disease resistance out there? While most diseases have some sort of solutions like chemotherapy or medications for flu, we think there are a few problems with this. Firstly, all these solutions are reactive rather preemptive. So this means that the people will have to suffer through the pain of this disease and go through multiple procedures to treat this disease. This looks like multiple sessions of chemotherapy once you discover that you have cancer. And we would argue that this is not worth it and should be a thing of the past. We think secondly, there are also a multitude of risks that comes with treatment and procedures, right? Especially when it comes to complicated medical surgeries and experimental medications. Firstly, in regards to the pricing, where a lot of people may not be able to afford this new and expensive technology simply because pharmaceutical companies would like your wallet more than your life. But also in regards to adverse side effects, where these treatments come with a lot of risk, or even if it is able to be continued properly, we're able to ensure that these treatments ensure that your body becomes weaker, right? At the end of the day, we think people are still subject to dangerous conditions on Earth, and they shouldn't be able to take these risks when it comes to treatments. How do we solve this on a comparative? We think, firstly, genetic engineering is an uncomplicated medical procedure with minimal procedure to edit portions of your cells and replanting the cells back into your body. We think the body will be able to accept and integrate their own cells. But we think also, secondly, it is more cost effective compared to the global cost of medical treatments that are done for other diseases. Note that the treatments that exist on the side of opposition will always be continuous and multitude in nature, whereas on our side, we're able to preempt diseases and do a one-off solution for this. In regards to adaptability, this is important because in response to diseases that might emerge in the future, our one-off solution may be able to ensure that we prevent the cost of responding to diseases in the future. We think we fulfill our burden of ensuring that and proving that gene modification has the potential to extend human life to an extent that we've never seen before, and I've never been prouder to propose.
Thank you to the Prime Minister for the speech. Now, to open the case from the opposition team, I call upon the leader of opposition to continue the debate session.
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, could you just give me
Yes,
a minute? Sorry, hold on.
Rush.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ashika. I am the leader of opposition, opposed against today's motion. I'm going to be talking about a few things here, specifically talking about the permanency of genetic engineering, and especially since the Prime Minister has done a relatively good job of explaining to us about how this is going to be an inherited like an inherited therapeutic that will be offered to these people, and something that can be inherited by generations to come. I think the permanency of it is something that we're going to characterize, and the issues that come up with that. The second thing is talking about like the inaccessibility part, which I feel that PM didn't really address and didn't really explain, and why that's important, especially because if you're going to be increasing funding and research, you're also going to eventually find this to be slowly implemented, which is, I think, like that's the vibe that I get from PM, that this is something that's going to be slowly integrated into society, and how the inequality and the inequity that creates, like the harms that come with that. And secondly, like the principle of also like changing your child's genetics and the precedent it sets, like this technology sets, and why like the definition of disease and the difficulty it is even for the scientific community to differentiate between diseases, and why that's important, and why we feel like glossing over it and saying like, oh yeah, like just general increase in immunity, and saying like, yeah, that's all that we're doing, that's all that we're doing. Why we feel like that's not an acceptable way to approach that's not the only burden that side government has to take here, and why we believe that there's additional harms that come with that. And thirdly, like the short-term harms that come, that we feel by investing more into this technology and taking like the opportunity cost that takes away from exploring exploring cures, vaccine, the money that goes into management, prevention, why we believe that that's inherently more important than going into genetic engineering. So like the first point being like the inaccessibility point, we find why this is more important. Why this is important to talk about is because like the people who cannot afford gene editing are simultaneously the people that are the most affected by these diseases, right? Like long chronic diseases, especially like acute diseases, even like they're the ones that struggle the most with this issue, and we don't really understand like why genetic engineering necessarily benefits them in this regard. And in fact, like as we can see, like in status quo, like wealthier people or diseases that like happen to wealthier people within cities and not like within rural areas, especially, like their diseases are more often than not prioritized. Like for example, hand foot mouth disease is an example of like a disease that happens within rural communities that's more often than not neglected by the government. And the reason why it's like that, it happens to be that way, or even rare diseases for that matter, like diseases that rarely happen, like don't really get the attention that they deserve. And we think that the people who really like who don't get who are already marginalized will be further marginalized under this, under accepting this research, even if it's used as it's intended, by the way. Like we're not even like talking about the possibility of like, what if it's not used as it's intended, and what if people change what it means for a disease to be a quote unquote disease. For example, if you extend it to like psychiatric diseases, if you extend it to like how liberally the word disease has been used in the past, and how like people will take advantage of that. Like we're not even talking about that, but let's say in the best case scenario, we imagine that people use it as it's intended. Some people get it and some people don't. I think that that's something you got to accept, and we have that too, and to an extent. Like in status quo, we also have some people that don't have access to that. But at least in status quo, some of the money that could have been used, that's invested in bettering the lives of people that don't necessarily need their lives to be bettered, like that money can now be used in building infrastructure, improving the lives of those people, rather than rather than taking the opportunity cost and spending that money to benefit people that may not necessarily be affected by these diseases. But also the social ramifications that come from that, the increased tensions that comes from people, the increased reluctance, and also the added burden that is given to parents that can't afford this, especially because I don't think they really explain, is this going to be happening to children? Is this going to be happening to adults? When is this going to happen? We're going to assume from a scientific background, from a medical background, it's probably going to happen embryologically. It's probably going to happen as the baby is born, and that's additional. That's an additional burden for parents to carry, that if they can't afford this, then oh my gosh, I'm putting my child further at risk, right? Sure, I'll take a PY.
All of your problems have been about implementation. Engage with our principle as to why gene editing should be allowed.
I think the issue that we have with the idea of gene editing is because disease, you need to talk about the motion, right? It's about being more disease resistant. But our issue with the principle is that the word disease resistant, or what it means to be resistant to diseases and what it means to have a disease, is a very difficult, it's already very difficult for us to differentiate, for example, mental disorders, being a disease. Yes, it's a disease to an extent, but a neuroatypicality is also very difficult to differentiating between abnormal and normal. And if you're just going to be talking about, making us more immune resistant, right? Okay, you have increased immunity in your own, and that may be fair, but as we're going to talk about later, just because you have increased immunity in some regard, by the way, there are also additionally autoimmune diseases where even though you might have increased immunity, that doesn't necessarily protect you from chronic illnesses, because chronic illnesses, especially for autoimmunity, it's not really about your cell's individual reaction. That in itself, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, though. That's the reason why I don't really want to get into that. But the reason why we think that it's important is that the characteristic of it being so complicated and it being so varied in its and in the way it could be applied, that has an effective harm. Because what if the term disease is used in a way that can marginalize people? What if the way that it is used makes people feel like they are not represented in those communities? So what are you going to do then? How do you mitigate those harms? And is it necessary to mitigate those harms when you're really only affecting a group of people that don't really need this, right? The people that would benefit from this, I don't think you've really explained why they would necessarily benefit from this. So the true stakeholders of this debate, the ones that really matter, the ones that are the people that probably won't have access to it. But even if they did have access to it, what if you don't also you also have to address the crux issue of, if it's implemented in a way that it shouldn't be, why we feel that that's inherently wrong? Because the slippery slope of how disease is defined, the slippery slope of how becoming more quote unquote disease resistant can be defined, that is the issue that we take with this. Because once you start changing what a person's genetics to make them quote unquote have a better quality of life, it really then puts into jeopardy the people currently in society that are suffering with that quality of life, and you take away the resources that they have equally. And not to mention, because the people that you're helping are more so going to be wealthier and already are focused on in status quo, we don't really see the necessity for this. And we also think that it will cause more harm than good when people who misuse this technology will also be affected by it as well. But that is the case. Thank you.
Thank you to the Leader of Opposition for the remarks. Now, I'd like to continue our debate. I'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case from their side.
Hello, I hope I'm audible. Okay.
Yes, you are.
Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. The reason why opposition cannot take this debate is because they themselves don't know why this should not be a solution to disease resistance. If you listen to the speaker before me, a lot of the analysis on why disease resistance or why gene editing is bad is because it will contribute to disease resistant humans. But because we are uncertain as to what can include into disease resistance, and in her words, doesn't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of what disease resistance will look like, then that is a reason enough as to why we should prevent cutting edge technology to be applicable to individuals who are suffering from cancer, diabetes, AIDS, and any other potential diseases. This debate is not about us having to prove that if gene editing cannot resolve every form of disease, then we cannot support gene editing. I can concede that for a lot of mental illnesses, it will be challenging to edit the genes to manage things like anxiety, depression, because these are all things that do not have the appropriate research for, or things like for chronic illness. I don't know why that is true, because that is still dependent on cellular structure, and as long as gene editing can respond to stimulus, it will be able to find an appropriate response. But let us take it at best case. Doesn't necessarily negate or discredit all of the other forms of diseases that we are able to combat that just cannot happen in status quo. All the analysis of their alternatives in status quo are already something that we preempted. It takes risk and cost to cure cancer, and that risk and cost comes with side effects that are completely not worth it. You lose your fertility, you lose your hair, you become extremely thin. For diabetes and AIDS, all forms of experimental medication are causing inflammations of throats or causing other forms of pain that you have to manage if you want to avoid greater risks of the symptoms of diabetes and AIDS. All of this goes to show that these alternatives are not enough. They are causing people pain. And given the fact that there's a potential of removing this, why isn't it something that we should opt into? It's because other diseases will continue to exist. That does not justify why we shouldn't respond to. That's like saying we shouldn't invest in the COVID vaccine because cholera will still exist. Ebola is still a threat in Africa and somewhere. Therefore, forget vaccines of COVID, because the money that you spend on COVID, you can spend on cholera. It's not a dichotomy. It's a dependence of which is the most significant threat that exists in status quo. If there's a solution to resolve this significant threat, why shouldn't we invest in resolving this significant threat? So while it is regrettable that there are other diseases like chronic illnesses or mental illnesses that I'll take you in a minute, that we cannot cater for, it is one that is not dependent on whether we support or invest in gene modification. But before that, yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's say we consider one significant threat, which is COVID, right? Why is it that we should prioritize making a few humans resistant to COVID-19 over, let's say, developing a vaccine so that it's equitable, so that everyone can be resistant to COVID-19? We believe that the funding should be in the vaccine part.
Yeah. I don't believe that we are focusing on making COVID, on making only a few people resistant to COVID. There has been 165 billion cost to develop the vaccines needed to make everyone resistant to COVID. That is a hefty price to pay, but it is a price that we do because we recognize its importance. So it's not a debate about creating this technology where only few people will have access to. I don't think so. You can let them run away with the idea that only the rich will have access to this medication for two reasons. The first is costs of medication reduce over time once it becomes easier to manufacture and blueprint. This is true for any types of process. So if it is true that the cost is exorbitant in the beginning for individuals to access gene modification, there is no evidence to show why that will be true for a long time. The first is incentive structure. Because there are only few rich people in this world, why would we create technology that is only accessible to such a small market? It doesn't make sense. But secondly, and more importantly, the idea is to make this more accessible so that humanity can become more immune as a herd as compared to only individuals that are few in nature. So it is not true. But even in the worst case, where it is true for a short period of time, then it is perfectly fine. C-section, which is a safe way to deliver a child, was only accessible to rich women from high-class societies because of its complicated and expensive nature as a medical procedure. Today, it is the most effective way and the most and it is the only way in which a lot of women choose to deliver a child. So this just goes to show why this will become more accessible. And given we already give you a comparison of cost, i.e. individuals having to spend money on multiple sessions of chemotherapy, multiple types of medications for different ailments that they face, the cost in order to modify your gene and then have your child inherit is by far cheaper in comparison to all that exists in status quo. They have no evidence to show that the current ways in solving ailments in status quo is cheap for the average person or for the vulnerable stakeholders that they want to talk about. I think a per session of chemotherapy is close to $6,000. I don't think so that resolves any of the problems that they want to resolve, but it happens better on our side, even if we have to concede that the initial cost will be high. Going into adaptability, because this is something that they must also reconcile with. In the best case of every opposition argument, this is only in resolution to the diseases that we know, not the diseases that we don't know, not the diseases that we cannot react in time to, not the diseases that can mutate. Because as much as humans can evolve and improve our immune systems, viruses and diseases can do the same. The problem is when the pace of this is happening that disproportionately disadvantages human beings. COVID is mutating at a higher rate than which we can vaccinate to create herd immunity. HIV is creating more toxins in which we can create medications to ail the symptoms. Gene modification resolves this by improving the immune system to an extent in which we can match the pace of diseases evolving and of diseases being discovered. All in all, government tries to tell you that it is a regrettable world we live in, where it is difficult to challenge life-threatening diseases that we don't have a cure to, diseases that we don't know what's going to happen, and diseases that we don't know how they're going to evolve and mutate. Rather than waiting for vaccines to be created once we already suffer through the pain, or waiting for once you already have the disease that is incurable, modify your genes, invest in this research, and hopefully this is a better solution than waiting to go through that pain. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you to the speaker for such a good remarks. Now, I call upon the deputy leader of opposition to continue the case from their side.
All right, hello. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it is very interesting that in their speech, they have constantly brought up illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, AIDS, psychiatric illnesses, and said that gene editing is a solution to all of these. So in their paradigm, ultimately, their goal is to eliminate diseases, but we have pointed out a crucial flaw in their paradigm, and they have refused to take on the harm, that this technology is very, very expensive, and this will only be accessible to the rich. Firstly, they are saying that they will fund research, and they will ensure that at some point people will be able to be genetically modified to be disease resistant. Firstly, there was no proper characterization of diseases, and the second speaker just skimmed over a list of diseases which included psychiatric illnesses, chronic illnesses, and AIDS, and then went on to say that we will not be focusing on diseases that can mutate, which is a huge contradiction in the paradigm, which brings about the question, what do you classify as a disease, and what diseases are you endeavoring to tackle with this technology? Now, assuming that they endeavor to tackle the entire classification of what can be qualified as a disease, whether physical or psychiatric, let's look into the problems of this paradigm. Let's take the example of AIDS, which was given by the second speaker. AIDS is easily transmissible, and if you were able to make people resistant to AIDS, firstly, in your paradigm, this will only be accessible to those who can afford it. The issue here would be that people will grow complacent, right? They know that they're resistant to AIDS. They will not practice safety measures before they're engaging in sexual activities. There will be less of a need to gain informed consent from one another. People will feel less of a need to tell each other, hey, I have AIDS, we need to be careful. It's not going to happen because people are going to be like, oh, I'm resistant to AIDS. It doesn't matter whether I'm a carrier. It doesn't matter whether I get tested. It doesn't matter because I'm resistant. And the people who are going to benefit, who are going to suffer the most from this, as we have pointed out, are our primary stakeholders, those who cannot afford this technology. This is why their paradigm is a failure. Ultimately, it is just a large investment into a technology that will not be accessible immediately or anytime soon, but hundreds and hundreds of years from now. Because as they have stated, they're merely moving in that direction. Why are we focusing on a solution that might be beneficial in the long term? Why are we investing so much into this solution when we could be focusing on the immediate short term and the long term goals by focusing on curing these diseases? it is regrettable that they have failed to take out any of the harms that we have mentioned. It was also very interesting that Ebola and cholera were brought up as examples by side government. We have already stated that this technology is firstly going to be accessible to those who can afford it, and those who can afford it likely do not see cholera as an issue. Do you think the top 5% of the world has to deal with the issue of drinking contaminated water or ingesting fecal material? No, they do not. Why will this technology be why would this technology endeavor to tackle issues that essentially are not a problem for the primary stakeholder, which is the rich? This is essentially the biggest issue in their paradigm, which we have told you, which we have continuously told you, due to the extensive cost. And even assuming that someday you are able to make genetic engineering accessible, even if someday everyone has access to this technology, we are not looking at today or tomorrow. We are not even looking at 100 years from now. We are looking at least 200, 300 years from now, because we simply do not have the technology to even if all funding was to be directed towards this project of yours, it will take an extremely long time in order for us to have a sufficient understanding of the human genome in order to ensure that this technology is cheap and accessible. So the immediate harm in your case, assuming that this technology works, is accessibility, and then the long term, and this is going to actually further propagate the socioeconomic divide that separates the rich and the poor. Because firstly, as we have previously mentioned, this is primarily harming those who cannot afford this technology. It's going to lead to increased discrimination against those who have diseases. It's going to widen the gap between the rich and the poor. And as funding is directed here, what do we do about problems we are dealing with right now? What do we do about COVID? What do we do about what do we do about diseases that people suffer from now? By focusing on this long term, you're going to let a lot of people die in the short term, because this solution cannot be applied to everyone, which is a burden that side government has to take on. Now let's look at the conceptual mistake. They have failed to define diseases, and they have named a number of diseases, including psychiatric illnesses. So now we must look at what allows one to classify something as a psychiatric illness. If someone has depression or anxiety, you're just going to alter their genes and cure them. But here's the issue: where's the threshold for what we classify as depressed and what we classify as anxious? How do we know that we are not modifying essentially aspects of their personality rather than treating a disorder? What about autism? What about ADHD? These are all classified as psychiatric disorders, but then there's a very fine line between what we classify as this disorder. Let's assume you have people with mild depression, you have people with moderate depression, you have people with severe depression, right? So if you draw the line at moderate depression, the issue is going to be maybe those with extreme depression will benefit, but the issue is going to be, what about those with moderate levels of depression? How do you know, is this for this person it's a personality trait that they tend to be sadder than others? For this person it's depression. It's going to raise a lot of ethical issues, because the implications are, if you are a certain way that allows people to perceive your existence as a disease, what right do others have to change this? Also, let's talk about one more thing that hasn't been brought up yet. So let's talk about consent. So they told us that they told us that gene editing is going to be done. It's going to enable people to enable it to be passed down through generations. However, they also said this is not going to apply to diseases that mutate. So this essentially renders a huge flaw in their entire paradigm. So if you want gene editing to be a one-off solution and you want it to be passed down to kids, what about diseases that mutate? You can't do anything about that. So essentially, this is not. They have shown us within their own arguments that this is completely ineffective. It is merely a waste of money that serves to further propagate the divide between the rich and the poor, and ultimately serves no purpose whatsoever for immediate problems that we are dealing with. This also results in growing contemplacy and a general disregard for hygiene, because people know they are resistant, right? They are not going to think about those around them. Oh, what about my classmates at school? No, they're just going to say, oh, hey, I'm resistant. I can do what I want because I know I'm not going to get sick. And this is a kind of mentality that we do not want in our society, because it is an ultimate detriment, and it will lead to a society that cares less about one another. Because hey, we are widening inequalities. We aren't helping the stakeholders who are most at risk, which are the poor. And let's talk about those who are ill, right? Let's talk about the chronically ill, those who are sick right now. If we want to divert a majority of our funds into this research, which will not be available for hundreds of years, what about those who are sick? What about those who need treatment now? I think the main failure of the government is, firstly, there are multiple flaws in the structure of their paradigm, which has been previously brought out. Their solution is one that will benefit us years and years in the long term and does nothing for those who need immediate help. And lastly, they are not even efficient at tackling the diseases that they endeavor to tackle, because they have acknowledged that mutation happens, and we cannot genetic engineering cannot be a one-off solution that's passed down through generation, because mutations happen, and therefore this is something that people will need to be administered to people regularly, generation to generation. And this essentially ties back into their argument about being cost effective, which we have already shown. We have shown you that it is not cost effective. We have shown you that this is not efficient, and we have shown you that there are more immediate problems and more important stakeholders who are at risk right now that side government has completely failed to address. Sorry, can I get a time check?
Your time is up.
All right, thank you. I have never been prouder to represent.
Thank you to the speaker for this speech. Ladies and gentlemen, and the honorable adjudicators, I shall now call upon the government whip to rebut.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thanks. Opposition loses this debate because they push the burden on us to proving absolute outcomes. That is, we have to prove gene editing to large extent solves all the diseases, and if they can pick one disease that we cannot solve, we ought to ban it. That is, we have to prove that allocation will be perfect, that everyone can access. If certain groups of people cannot access it, we ban it. Hang on. Our burden is just to prove to a large extent it has numerous benefits into not only finding cures to diseases, but acknowledging that diseases can be an adversity to people and preemptively creating gene additions and modifications in which you don't have to go through that. We think we have always proved to you illustratively what the advancement of science technology is and why we should continue the evolution to find better cures to diseases so that future generations don't have to go through what past generations have gone through and get a more equitable and safer and a better world for all of us to live in. I think opposition was very disingenuous into debating under that paradigm. So in my speech, I think essentially this debate boils down to one main issue, which is which side better caters towards solution towards diseases in the short term and long term. And I'll compare based on alternatives that opposition talked about and why do we still win this debate. But first prelude in this issue is on the idea of cost. And panel point that a large chunk of opposition's case was in the idea of resource allocation, how it'd be inaccessible, and they just blew up all the harms of inaccessibility. The first response panel is that this debate was never like a this house would debate, but it's a this house support. So more so the debate should be on the narrative and the principal ethics of whether or not we ought or ought not to do it, and whether the practicality of whether or not it's something that is good. So it's not so much of the bureaucratic processes of allocation and resources, because we have to discuss on the principles of gene editing and why is it good or bad, not so much of the technology and not so much of the resource allocation, because it's not a policy debate in of itself. But even if it is, and for the sake of engagement, if it's a contentious issue, what's our response to that? We think they have never dealt with the other responses of retrospectively how technology works as well. We think it's inevitable that there is a segregation between rich and poor when it comes to access to technology. But more importantly, that's never an excuse for us to completely ban it insofar as the tangible benefit that it can provide towards people who can access it. And this is important. The fact that also commercially we've seen like very highly priced products in which lesser people, rich people or people who cannot afford it, cannot access it. That does not mean it's an excuse for us to ban it insofar as there's no insurmountable harm that it creates to the environment or to people. We posit that the technology works in a way in which it proliferates downwards over time. That is to say, over time, technology and our access of gene modification may be more accessible in the long term, even if it were to be a costly process. We think insofar we can trade off maybe some extent of poor people cannot accessing right now, but maybe later on in the distant future where they can. This is much beneficial because in entirety we're able to create better cures towards diseases, which I'll illustrate later on. And secondly, we think we can preemptively put them in positions in which they don't have to suffer the adversity of getting all these diseases. All that inaccessibility is an excuse for us to not continuously evolve in this research that literally saves life. I think that comparative is very important. Second, they told us that the alternative is an either or. This debate is not a zero-sum game. It is not, on one hand, we put all our money in heavily prioritized research into gene editing and completely abandoning any cures for diseases, and at the same time opposition says they will only have all things like vaccine. What's the debate about? We think essentially what this means is that it is not inconsistent for us to say that we will heavily fund all this sort of research but also find cures to diseases because it's a concurrent problem that people face. The fact that pandemic is heavily implicating a lot of lives, that obviously means there'll be incentive towards getting vaccines to treat these people right now. But the long-term solution, the continuous process of research still can happen under our world. This is important. Although on a surface level, it means like we have like unlimited resources, it actually isn't. Because what does supporting look like? And it already came out in Prime Minister's speech, which to a large extent, we support that research. We have regulations, which means even private centers, they already have CRISPR technology and gene editing with regards to modifying corn, for example, or any other GM, what's the term? The gene modified animal, basically the food that we eat. That is probably genetically modified. We already have institutions that already have this form of research. So it doesn't take a lot of funding. We just have to legalize that form of research and institute that you continue the research for gene modification for disease related as well. If it means that we were to subsidize, we think maybe we'll subsidize to some extent, but isn't like from scratch to create whole industries and from scratch to start all this research from very get-go, because all this research already exists. We just legalize more scientific research on that area. That means we still have a lot of money into healthcare as well, because we don't think healthcare systems completely dissolve or eliminated at the point in which we legalize or support some form of research towards this area, so we can have both at the same time. But even if, for the sake of engagement, let's say they want us to defend a world in which all our healthcare money goes into only like gene modification, and suddenly vaccines all disappear and cures to cancer all stop, why do we still think it's a legitimate paradigm? First, we think all our speakers already told you why this is much better than alternative measures that exist, simply because firstly, a lot of measures that we get right now have severe side effects. That is, for example, if you were to go through processes of let's say chemotherapy because of cancer, we think all this makes your bodily functions much weaker and you also have to suffer as a result of that. We think also if we look retrospectively how we've always had mechanisms that make you disease resistant. For example, having anti-venom that modifies your bloodstream to make you more resistant to toxins. What does two of these things show? It shows that retrospectively we have taken mechanisms to make sure people are disease related, resistant, and we extend the principle towards gene modification as well. And more importantly, we think alternative measures that exist in right now are simply not enough or not effective, because you also go through a lot of severe side effects that make you weaker. And we think the cost of you going through that pain isn't a worth-off trade-off. We think funding this research means in the long term, to a large extent, people won't even have to go through this. People won't have to suffer. People live much better lives if they're able to not even go through the disease in the first place, therefore live better off lives. We think we support this evolution, and they've never been charitable into drawing out the comparative to a large extent. We think to a large extent we also prove the urgency of this matter, and that is diseases are becoming more mutated. For example, the Delta variant in the COVID-19 virus. That just shows that diseases are becoming more hybrid, more dominant. There's an urgency for us to create a mechanism to counter it from the first place, because it's impossible for us to organically adapt. The only examples of people that can evolve, for example, like the sea divers in like certain areas, they have longer splints rather than general people, because they have natural ability to evolve because of communities. But that benefit doesn't trickle down to every single person. Not everyone can evolve and be resistant to certain diseases by a flick of your hand. It has to have some form of policy to be able to make sure we evolve those diseases and research and actually have those benefits trickle down. I think that's important to note. We think the continuous process that we create is something that is much better for the livelihood of people in the short term as well as in the long term. We think those circumstances don't contradict with current public healthcare systems that do actively also find cures to diseases. why does opposition lose this debate? Opposition loses this debate because they were very only targeted towards the nitty-gritty details of like the technicalities of funding, which we think is already tackled down to a large extent. They never dealt with the ethics of gene editing and also the principles of why or not this is good. And we think for those grounds, we told you illustratively why this is a really good model for currently and also for our future. Proud to propose.
Thank you to the government whip for the remarks. Now it's time to listen to the rebuttal of the opposition whip.
Okay. Good morning / afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last speech substantive of today, right? Okay. First of all, let me just say that I feel like the government whip was a bit disingenuous in trying to characterize our arguments and trying to summarize our points, right? But I guess that's my job, not his, so it's okay, right? And first of all, just because he touched it kind of like very, very late in his speech and not even in the first or second speaker's speech, I'm just gonna like touch it, right? Instead of going too much into it. Urgency is not a point in their favor because it's rather a point in our favor because as I mentioned, right? Genetic engineering is not something that you can just instantly do. It's something that requires time because it's very, very complicated, not uncomplicated at all. And my second speaker has already touched on that our side has the time advantage, right? So let's just get urgency out of the way. Let's move on to the actual debate. Now, first of all, let's try to finalize what we actually want and how do we determine whether government or opposition wins, right? This house supports, right? Like, sure, you can say that you guys are being charitable by saying that we're not it's not a this house would ban either, okay? The merits of whether or not government would win is not whether or not genetic engineering research should be done. Because if it's done, for example, takes up 1% of resources, you can't say that you guys win this debate. So let's try to characterize it like this. Is genetic engineering for health purposes being done, should it be prioritized, right? So that's as charitable as I can imagine it, right? And I hope you guys agree with that. So yeah, there we go. That's how we want to see who wins or not, right? Also, it's very disingenuous to say that we only care about resource allocation. Well, first of all, resource allocation is very important because resources are limited and diseases are being spread as of now. So it's a very, very valid argument. Secondly, we did bring up ethical arguments, and yeah, we totally did. But let me just also the ethical argument about like when you said like inequality exists in the first place, like there are more expensive medicines, more expensive treatment that are available to richer people, right? We don't like that either, okay? We're against inequality, but you can't expect us to argue about everything in the medical field, right? We're just talking about genetic engineering, so let's stay on that point, right? So what we're against is basically inequality, and we both want outcome where the health of the universe, the health of like humans is better, right? So that's going to be the yardstick for debate, okay? Yeah, actually, the reason that you think that we didn't talk about ethics is because you didn't engage on it. So I'll go into that later. Okay, first things first, right? Germ theory is one of the most important discoveries to medicine, right? And why was it important, right? It was because people knew that you could wash their hands, right? That's the most important thing ever in medicine. And the first thought of the person who discovered germ theory wasn't let's make everyone immune to germs. No, it was let's wash off these germs. Prevention is better than cure. In our scenario, we are actually the prevention part, right? Because I'll get into it later. Let's talk about genetic engineering. This is very important, right? What is it actually? It's not vaccines, because if vaccines were considered like when you said like take away cells, introduce it to whatever, and then put it back in, that's actually literally like what vaccines is. That's not what genetic engineering is. If that was considered genetic engineering, then eating oranges to prevent scurvy would be, right? So what is it actually? It's changing the genetic code of your person, right? And you can't change the genetic code of adults because their genes are already expressed, right? You can't just change a few genes and save the whole body, right? So you need to do it embryologically. When you do it embryologically, it's super complicated. This is an assumption that government has made that has no basis in reality whatsoever, because genetic engineering is hard. Okay, it's very hard. You can't even, there are physical proportions to embryology that's very hard to solve. Like those are physical. Genetics should be way more harder. So it is totally valid that my second speaker has said that genetic engineering, I'm not saying it's impossible, by the way. I'm just saying it's very complicated. It won't be done immediately. It will take a lot of time and it will be super expensive. That we believe is valid, right? So that's one major clash point. They believe it's cheap It's not, right? So how much would it actually cost? It's expensive. Okay, but we're not against it just because it's expensive, right? Sure. But the problem is when it's not 100% to everyone, this increases like the inequality of health itself, right? Like sorry, when you change the individual genes of like one embryo of one person, right? Is it more cost effective? Like if you want to talk about resource allocation, is it more cost effective to make 1,000 people, for example, let's say that's a lot, like 1,000 people in a community resistant to dengue fever, rather than just fogging the place, right? Prevention is better than cure in this scenario, right? Which one is more expensive? Making less people have diabetes or making insulin more accessible, right? That's the problem when we prioritize genetic engineering because it's so expensive, because it requires so much resources. If it's a non-zero like prioritization, for example, is over 50%, right? Then you reduce the cost that you reduce the amount of funding that is into developing cures, that is into accessibility for people, for example, who are blind, right? Let's say you make less people blind in the world. That would mean that there will be less accessibility for blind people, right? iPhones won't care about having voice readouts anymore because it's just not profitable, right? And let's talk about the ethicality of it. Sorry, there's a lot to say here. Sorry. We didn't get into the nitty gritty of diseases itself because we were trying to be charitable, right? But now because the government has mentioned it, right? Let's talk about it. The human experience of diseases is very wildly very different, right? We talked about autism, we talked about ADHD, right? I myself have ADHD. I don't really consider it a disease. Sometimes it's hard for me, but I know how to control it, right? The human experience of certain diseases is different. And so like the notion of the parents' will extending on the children is very harmful. This is the ethical part of the argument. This is what you missed out in the first, second, and second speaker, right? What would happen in, let's say, conservative country where sexuality or certain parts of personality is considered a disease, right? Gayness is a disease. Let's eradicate that. That's bad, right? That's ethically bad, right? What about certain other, let's say, talk about diseases itself, right? Men are more susceptible to prostate cancer, right? Because they're men. So just make everyone a woman because then you prevent prostate cancer. It's a bit complicated. It's more complicated than that. There is a lot of ethicality to it, right? So let's talk about the health of the people, right? Which side actually has better health, right? First of all, we agree that they have better individualized health. To the individual, they have better health, right? But in our case, we have better universal health. So basically, universally speaking, more people are healthier on average, right? And even if you preemptively prevent that disease in the individual, which is very, very good for the individual, I agree. But that is not universal and doesn't help other people. It's already 6, bro. And then which side benefits the most people, right? In our best case scenario, right, this is very, very expensive and very, very inaccessible, so only rich people have it. But even in the worst case scenario, where let's say 90% of people can afford it, you're still ostracizing the 10% of people. You're still making life harder for the 10% of people, and that's not something that they engage with at all. That's not something that they want to take that harm at all. They try to carry this case by saying that there is no harm at all, and that's simply not true. We take some harms, they don't. That's the difference between government and opposition, right? Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the opposition whip. Now, we have heard all the 3 speakers from both teams. We shall take a short break of 1 minute. During this time, both the government and the opposition teams will prepare the reply speech. The time of 1 minute has ended. I should now invite the opposition leader from the opposition team to deliver the reply speech.
Okay. Okay. So hi everybody. I'm just going to be really quick in talking about what were the main clash points in this debate and why we believe that we take this debate. So I think the first part about genetic modification genetic engineering that we wanted to talk about, engineering by the way, not necessarily even modification, was the issue of cost and like why we feel that we really win out on this part especially, and the ramifications of that, and why our paradigm that we took so long, many layers of analysis to explain why we feel that we win out on this and why it's important. So first of all, I think Mikhail, the previous speaker, has already mentioned and explained to you, because it's so complicated, because it's so difficult to understand, there needs to be a huge initial investment to have breakthroughs, to develop, and to put money to find any solution for it to be effective, right? So we engaged with government on the idea that, yeah, you might have some breakthroughs, but you're going to need to take a lot of money out of healthcare in order to have those breakthroughs, A, be accessible to everybody, and B, or accessible to enough of people that we feel that is enough, and B, you won't actually like you say that no, you can still have like diseases and things like that on your side. Like, yeah, that's fine, but you're gonna have fewer of those. Fewer people are gonna have access to the healthcare that they deserve. Some people have higher individualized healthcare, but those are not the people that actually need better healthcare. The people that need better healthcare, the people that are marginalized, the people that don't necessarily have access to these, and the people that are already disenfranchised. And should this continue and eventually be implemented, which we agree that it will get cheaper over time, you know, like we agree with that. We agree that it will get cheaper over time, but we don't believe that it will be cheap enough to compete with other ways in which to manage and deal with illnesses, which, by the way, a lot of the illnesses that they talked about have like management have like management therapies, have cures, like have all these things that can be dealt with without having to pay a big sum of fee to change your child's genetics. And we also talked about how, you know, the social tensions that create, and how like that's also ethically unfair. That's the ethics that they also didn't want to take on, but we take that on. So secondly, we wanted to talk about what is better for everyone overall in the long term. You know, like long term, we're going to be like more resistant to these diseases. Well, in the long term, as this technology becomes more and more more normalized, we also wanted to talk about the long term idea of people taking genetic engineering too far, people taking the idea of a disease too far and changing genetics too far. And how are you going to change that? Okay, you're going to talk about regulation, you're going to talk about all those things, but you refuse to talk about the harms that come towards people in countries where maybe Saudi Arabia decides that they're going to do genetic engineering that caters to sexuality. Like, you don't want to engage in things, and we wanted to talk about those things as well, because that's a long-term thing that could happen. Like, these technologies are not only going to develop in the way that you want to develop, and you're not going to engage on like how you're going to prevent those harms and why it's worth that. We think that it's not worth it because status quo already deals with diseases in a way that's good enough and for rich people that will probably most likely benefit from this. And spending more money to cater to them is not worth it, first of all. Second of all, it's going to make poor people that can't afford it resent them even more. And secondly, if it's misused in the long term or brings additional harm in a way that we don't really know how to regulate, that is something that also needs to be addressed ethically by your side as well, that wasn't necessarily brought up or talked about at all. So I think that this is personally why we take the case, because we took on a lot of harms. We took on the possibility of not everybody being like not everyone having an individualized genetic health that they may have on your side. But overall, I think that we demonstrate how when you support this technology, it doesn't actually tackle like the problem at hand, and it doesn't help the people that need help the most. And so with that, rest in case. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the speech. I shall now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister from the government team to deliver their reply speech. Your mic is not unmuted yet.
Sorry. Here is why we win. First, on cost. The global cost of vaccination for the COVID pandemic is 1.2 trillion US dollars per year. Does that mean we stop providing cures for people who are suffering from cancer? Does it mean we stop giving insulin to people? Does it mean people don't have access to medication for AIDS? Does it mean we stop research into the diseases of cardiovascular therapy? No, it doesn't. Does it even mean that we remove the opportunity, or we create higher costs for mental health? No. Do we remove therapists? Do we make hospitals smaller? No, because all of these things are not mutually exclusive. Why? Because they are part of the same industry. They are part of the same factor, which is healthcare. So this debate is not about if we support gene editing, it means that we are taking away significant portions of funds from people who are suffering ailments now, because that does not make sense. The response that anyone can give is to take funding from anything else that is deprioritized, like what everyone around the world is doing. To cater for the high costs of vaccines, they defund things like the military or their space programs. All of this has to go with hand in hand with, they do not prove that because there's an increased cost in gene editing, everyone else will suffer. But even to some extent, in the best case, if that is true, that's okay, because what exists in the alternative is hemodialysis very cheap. What is the response you get, or what is the evidence you get from them that tells you that everything is cheap? They tell you make insulin more accessible. Hello, insulin doesn't cure diabetes. It's a continuous medication you take until the day you die, in the hopes that you don't lose failure um of processing sugars in your body. All of this goes to show that it is not important. Why are they protecting current forms of medicine that is not effective? Why are they focusing on current forms of medication that is already expensive, inaccessible, and difficult for the average man to access? We do not stop the research into heart transplant surgery because the person in rural India can never access heart transplant surgery. We do not stop the research or the procedure of kidney transplants because in the list of who deserves a kidney, a poor person is unlikely to be at the top. These are all the realities of medicine that they do not change. And even if I think it is regrettable, that's not part of the debate. Let's go into the second reason, into ethics. All these ideas about how there exist diseases that gene editing will never solve, or all the ideas of gene editing you cannot put on adults, you can only put if it's in the embryonic stage. I am not a doctor. The whip is not a doctor. None of us are doctors. Even if some of us are studying to become a doctor, none of us have the expertise into gene modification. That's why this debate is not on what is feasible in gene editing, because none of us know what's happening in CRISPR. But what we do know is that the foundation of gene editing is to alter specific areas of your cells, to alter your structure. And once that structure is altered, it can respond to numerous types of stimuli. So this is not a debate about what is classified as a disease. Just because they think Syria thinks gayness is a disease doesn't mean it's biological in nature, and then gene editing can account for that. It's so strange that on one hand they'd say that you'll never be able to solve mental problems because it's not a disease, but you can change the structure to make a woman into a man because some people consider being a woman a disease. All of these things are outside of what the contentious areas of this debate is, which is whether the potential exists and whether we should invest in this potential, and whether this potential is something that is important. All in all, we told you three things. We told you, first, alternative measures of disease is not effective and is costly. Second, we told you that the human is unable to adapt to future diseases or the mutations of diseases. The third is we told you how gene modification specifically tackles these two problems, and all responses we get to these two things are implementation, which we will not which will have no idea yet, costs that are not zero sum, and ethics which are not part of this debate. Things like gayness and womanhood. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you. Now we have come to the end of the debate. As mentioned earlier, this debate is a silent debate. Thus, the verdict will be given later on. Thank you for all of your participating in this debate. With that, the House of Parliament is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you, Amir.
I wish
And
all of you the best.
You too.